Outcast. I'm your host, HC. With me, Al.
Wolf.
And Haddock.
And today, such a fun topic. Such a fun topic that is gonna cause no controversies or discussions or arguments or any World War IIIs on the internet whatsoever. Because today we are talking about cannons. And no, it's not the joke that you see in front of your eyes in case you are listening to this on the same tab, because that joke is going to assault your eyes if you're looking at it. We're talking about canonicity when it comes to franchises, games, movies, TV shows, the like. We are going to talk about all of that.
I don't
Are you guys
appreciate you.
excited?
I don't appreciate you insulting my work. I put all of about 5 minutes into this background.
You insult me all the time, so now we are even.
Well, you promised fights, and here we go.
Yeah. So Haddock, is this title card canon or not?
Oh, gosh.
In my defense, it does have cannons on it, so it's on the right track, whatever that track might be.
Okay, so jokes aside, let's talk. Let's to the two of you who don't know, let's start by what defines cannon, aside from a weapon that shoots huge balls and sinks ships. What is the definition of cannon, like in general, and what do we think of it? Haddock, you're the guest. By all means.
Oh boy, you give me full reign, just letting you know that if you give me an inch, I'll take a mile on this topic, and I will not quiet until you make me.
Okay, I'm ready. Challenge accepted,
Alright.
my friend. Challenge
Alright.
accepted.
So let's see, defining what canon means. The way that I define canon, if you're actually going to just lay out a definition, is canon materials are materials that are officially produced and sanctioned by the creators, the corporations, the businesses, etc. And this differs from fandom materials, which are made unofficially by fans.
Mhm.
So for me, I base it around the concept of officially published sources. And I can get more into this discussion once I let you guys have a little bit more chance to talk, but I have some more comments on how I define canon that way, why I define canon that way, and why I object others' reality and substitute it with my own when people start trying to talk about something different.
Okay, so you just prepared the huge amount of notes right next to you, and you're keeping them for the right occasion.
I have 3 pages of, well, I wouldn't call them notes, I'd call them angry rambles, but same difference.
Yeah, fair enough. So, Wolf, what is your take on the idea? What is your general definition of canon?
My general definition of canon. A long time ago, I suppose, when I was a young wee lad, it was, canon was
Here's
anything.
something that's not canon. Wolf was a boy at some point.
I
What the
know.
hell? He
I
was
mean, I've
old.
always been. Oh, yeah, I know. When I was younger, my definition of canon was anything that was, congruent with the story. That the main story you get from the main thing. If it agreed with that, if it was congruent with that, if it worked with that, then it was canon. But as I've gotten older, I think that's a definition that a lot of people still go with, right? And generally that means that there are some things you just push out, or you just don't accept as canon, or you just don't even bother with because they don't agree with that idea of canon, right? But as I've gotten older, I found that doing that tends to exclude a lot of stuff that is sometimes quite enjoyable in its own right. And I've kind of taken this idea that canon is, at least to me now, is a thing that I tend to split up more, I suppose, now. I don't just look at the canon story, I also look at, the character canon, the world canon, does it add things to that? And even if it doesn't, how does it play with that? And in my mind now, canon is this mix of things that I kind of define separately, which is for, I guess, the main base three, I suppose, would be story canon, character canon, and world canon, right? I kind of split it up and say, does this add to that, or does it play with it in interesting ways that I personally might find interesting? If yes, then I'm all over it. If no, maybe I won't get as into it, but I'll still try it out, right? Because again, it's trying to broaden the horizon and add more, not take away from, I suppose you could say.
Okay.
I
So-
really liked your comment. Sorry, can I hop in?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
I really liked the way that you said about expanding and broadening your horizon as versus narrowing it. Because you're right, I feel like the discussion when people start to try to make it about congruity, it starts turning into this game of narrowing. And everyone has different definitions of how to narrow. When by technicality, canon should be a very obvious official thing that's different from fandom materials, not so vague and nebulous that people can't agree on it. And so I like the idea of, there's all these official materials available to you. And that's why I use the term official materials instead of canon. But, there's all these materials available to you, and you can sort of look at them and you can sort of synthesize them and pick up and build on them and help refine your understanding of what an in-universe world can feel like. And so, however much you want to synthesize, you can. And I think that we all should have the right. And rather than discrediting the materials that you can use to build that synthesis, we just have those materials out there and say, well, I don't really prefer to talk about that. Or, yes, I like talking about that one.
Mhm. So, as to my definition of it, in one of my classes, we were kind of not necessarily in terms of media or stories or whatever. Canon was just kind of um, described as a series of works that is usually agreed upon by their creator as taking place together, like belonging together in a sort of order and timeline. And again, it's not necessarily in terms of you know movies or whatever. It's just a definition. It can also be attributed to news articles. That's how we will add that phrase. So to me personally, though, while what you guys said is right, and I agree with you, canon to me, in terms of what we're talking about, is also kind of what counts as part of the main story. What counts as part of the overall arc of something. For example, and I will usually say what the creators claim is canon, because at the end of the day, no one really knows the creation or the story better than the person who made it. So I usually just attributed canon to what comes out of the creator's mouths. Even if I don't necessarily agree with it or like what they're doing, I just they said it. The people behind the franchise for the in this case said it. Therefore, I can't really do anything about it. Even if I don't like it, it's still canon. Like sometimes things don't go in the direction you want, and so to me, canon is kind of just the chain of events that has a beginning, middle, and end. And other stuff, if they are canon or not, is usually up for the person who made it.
Yes, I would. I do really like that. And I like bringing up the fact that creators have a different authority than the fans.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, there is this thing called death of the author, where you could say, once a thing is out there, everyone is free to interpret it as they want to. But at the same time, the people who made it with an intent in mind, and so their their take on it is just as important, if you ask me, even if you agree with it or not. Which does lead us to the next question I have for you guys. what causes you to decide if something is canon or not? Like, what makes you say, like, you just experience a piece of media in a franchise and you're just going, this is canon or this is not canon? What what triggers that alarm?
Uh,
So you've heard my it's basically my theme song. I've said this so many times on blogs that I'm sure you know exactly what I'm going to say, and if you don't you'll be like, "Oh yeah, of course," when I say it. Canon is unequal to continuity. I will die on this hill. I will die on this hill like 20 times in a row. And if you take any takeaway from me, it's that one. So for me, I will take anything canon that has inside universe build up potential. So I'll accept movies, TV shows, video games, book series, guidebooks, DVD, commentaries, interviews, and more as a means of understanding how this universe is perceived by the authorities who have the authority to make this universe exist.
Mhm.
hmm.
Okay, that's fair. And actually, an interesting point. I remember you mentioning it. That is an interesting point. Wolf, what about you?
Again, going kind of back to when I was a young wee lad. Yeah, it was, my definition of, this isn't canon. If it doesn't follow the story, it's not canon. Like that's how I used to describe it. Now, I don't really know if I have a definition, at least for me now personally, of something that would be not canon per se. Because again, right? Because I know a lot of people, again, they don't prescribe to the idea that canon should be more separate between its different forms. A lot of people, like, if they talk about canon, they talk about it as a whole, is what they'll tell you. But then when you start getting into more of the specifics, it feels like what they're mostly getting at is story canon. But for me, again, like as I said, right, I've more differentiated it and I've kind of split it off into character canon, story canon, and world canon. So as long as it, as I said, adds something to one of those three, I tend to say, yeah, this is canon. Like, this is canon to me because it adds something. Even if it doesn't work out in other areas, as long as I can gain something from it, meaningful from it, or then I feel, yeah, that works as canon for me. I can take from that and I can use that in if I decide to write fan fiction or do anything, or just explore the idea of theories and such from that point, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think it's cool that the way that you delineate it is by like character versus world building and stuff. I tend to think about it as sort of like primary sources versus secondary sources sorts of
Hmm.
things. I know that's not the actual right terminology, but like main sources versus minor sources. There,
Mm-hmm.
that's
Yeah.
better. Cuz so like the
Mhm.
main sources are going to be the central storyline that if you took them away the entire franchise falls apart. And
Like,
then, you have like this, you know,
yeah, I
the
get you.
minor sources that are, yeah, you can just sort of add little tidbits to your understanding or tweak your way you think about a character or something.
Like, as an example, you have the How to Train Your Dragon movies compared to the graphic novels or the
I
shows
was
for some
I was
people,
gonna
maybe.
bring something with this up, but go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, I would just say first of all that in terms of what I consider canon or not, honestly, a lot of the times it just comes down to basic logic. I want to say you because you need to understand that during these times there are many franchises that have transcended time, and there are so many versions of them. Like how many times have Spider-Man been rebooted on the big screen? How many shows with the Ninja Turtles are there? So at some point, you just kind of learn to accept the fact that not everything with a franchise name on it is connected to the other. You know,
Hmm.
unless you bring up the multiple universes stuff, which the both franchises that I've talked about did this at some point. So, but like, for example, I won't say that the Michael Bay Ninja Turtles movie is in the same canonicity as the 2012 cartoon, which aired at the same time it came out. It's just the same franchise, but there are too many contradicting plot elements and you know backstory elements that just differ too much. For better or worse, you be the judge, but I can't look at these two things, despite being a part of the same thing, as canon to each other because it just doesn't work.
That's fair.
So there's there's that. Now, when it comes to arguments within Wolf mentioned How to Train Your Dragon, there are some people who would say Race to the Edge, all the show in entirety, Riders of the Defenders, all that stuff, is just not canon because of inconsistencies. And like Haddock said a few minutes ago, canonicity is not always continuity. And I think Race to the Edge messes a bit more in the continuity department than the canonicity department. Because yeah, some things don't always add up when you're trying to connect everything together, but at the same time, the basic fundamentals of this universe are still there. You have the same characters, you have the same rules that the movies establish. You have character relationships that carry on from one movie to the show to the other movies. You have characters referencing events. In that sense, that's canon. But now let's take Wolf's favorite show, Rescue Riders. Even I know, I was waiting for this one.
I
But
was waiting for Rescue Riders to be mentioned.
yeah, but the reason I mentioned
It's
this
the
is
best How
because
to Train
after
Your
that
Dragon
one,
thing there is.
shut up. Anyway, anyway, aside from that one special that they made, which outright references the movies, there are, there are some rules and characters and stuff within the Rescue Riders universe that kind of go against what's established in the movies. So that way you look at this and it's like, yeah, okay, no way these two exist in the same universe.
With that
Also, also,
said,
yeah.
Rescue Riders doesn't necessarily go against the books. And
Hmm.
it's interesting when you start looking at it, right? Because fans have this, and I get it, I do too, this need and this want to just have everything connected in some way. Because I remember when the first movie came out, right? Like, I remember a ton of people talking about how you could connect the movie to the books and you could say, like, the movie was a prequel, quote unquote, to the books. And, like, you had Hiccup, the third, and Hiccup in this movie was one of the like, you have Hiccup the third in the book, and you have this Hiccup being a former one of the Hiccups in the movie, in the movie,
Hmm.
Is
and
it all in
it's
the movies too, isn't he? I think he is.
he might be, but again, it was just a theory people came up with and wanted to connect
Yeah.
the books to the movie, right?
Though that's
Yeah.
actually connected. That connects to something though that and when Haddock said outside media and stuff, the media and the outside media does refer to to the movie Hiccup as Hiccup Horrendous Haddock the Third, like the
Yep.
book version. So if you take this into account, that theory kind of falls flat. For example.
We ignore
I
that.
think that goes back to creator intent, what you were talking about, HC, is we know through interviews, etc., that they took the first book and they modified it to be more movie friendly. Have the higher
That's true.
stakes, have the larger dragons, and so forth. But you can tell very clearly that what their basis was the first book's material. So the
Mhm.
out of universe knowledge of what the creators intended can inform our in universe theories. And while I'm like, go have fun, go wild with your theories of Hiccup the First, I completely deny that because I think that's too far from creator intent.
Mm-hmm. No, that's completely fair. I suppose it's worth asking, right? Again, right? Looking at fandom culture, and fandom culture does have that kind of want slash need slash the
Mm-hmm.
that idea of running wild, of wanting to connect everything, of everything being connected in some way. It's worth, and everything being congruent and all of that. It's worth asking, looking at the idea of canonicity and continuity. Should everything be connected in some way, or is it
I
more
would
enjoyable that
say
it isn't?
I
I'm
think
saying no.
I think there's two reasons why we should accept something as canon even if it's completely incongruent. The first one is just from a literary theory aspect, is you have to give some authority to a thing that you are literarily critiquing. And part of literary criticism is whether or not the story is good, whether or not the story actually fits together well. And, you can complain all you like about, whether it's consistent or not. A story cannot yeet itself out of existence simply by being self-contradictory. So you have to be able to give it enough authority to be like, yes, this deserves to be criticized based upon these elements of itself. And let's see, there was a second point, and I will remember it.
Welcome to the club.
Until you do, I actually have something to point out with this in that regard, because in terms of what Wolf said, like, let's say that a certain franchise gets a reboot, like, let's say, and my example here is that, I'm not sure if you remember, but have any of you guys heard of the Legend of Spyro games?
Yes.
The Spyro reboot?
Yes.
I know of them. I do not know much of them.
Like, basically, it's the trilogy where Elijah Wood voices Spyro of all
Right,
people.
okay.
But that's the thing, that this trilogy of games basically just leans on the premise of, it's not the Spyro you before then. It's not the original Spyro. It's a completely original story. It sends everything backwards to, and kind of tell. Actually, the first game in the trilogy is called A New Beginning. Like, they tell you right off the bat, this is not connected to anything which came before it. And I get it that rebooting is sometimes scary, especially for a franchise like Spyro that didn't have the chance to have many versions of it. But at the same time, trying and saying this is canon to what came before it, and I've seen someone make that argument that just because they bring one of the characters from the original games into the new continuity, it automatically means it's canon. And it's like, I'm sorry, no, this doesn't work like this. If something is telling you I'm a reboot and I'm going to do my own thing with the source material, you can compare it, sure, but judge it based on what it is, not what you want it to be.
Yeah, I like that. I will sometimes fudge it a little, going back to the How to Train Your Dragon universe, is sometimes I will use the books to inform how I perceive the movie universe, but I think about that much more loosely in the sense of one concept inspired the other. So for like the Spyro thing, I'd be like, okay, well, we know this about this universe generally. We can, posit how it inspired this new reboot. But you can't directly throw A into B because, as you said, they're two different storylines and they're intended to be separate. Even if they both come from the same official sources, they're just different iterations.
Like, for example, the Spider-Verse. Like, if you compare into the Spider-Verse platform, the comics, you would be surprised how different it is. And whatever you like best, that's up to you. But it just uses the concept, not the plot itself, and that's something that people should sometimes, I think, realize more when they're trying to look at franchise entries like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's completely fair because, like, another great example of this would be Final Fantasy VII and then Final Fantasy VII Remake that came out a while back, and what they did there, right? In terms of it being a quote-unquote remake, but it being sold as a remake, but ultimately end up being a completely, or has the appearance of, at the moment, considering how they ended it, that it's going to be a completely new story. Like, they're doing something entirely different and kind of rewriting everything, essentially, at this point, potentially. Right? Because spoilers, they have the entire idea that Aerith dies, but they're setting themselves up with the remake, right, to completely redo that, to completely change that potentially. And that's interesting because now, you have the creators, the original creators even, right, completely rewriting the idea of canon. And again, like, that's super interesting because now, and I guess that kind of shows just how, to a degree, nebulous of an idea canon can be and how little import that it does technically have, at least as far as critique goes, I feel.
I even think as far as understanding story goes, it should be looser as well. You talked about how fandom has this very, very driving desire to connect everything together.
Mhm.
And it is very fun, but that can destroy yourself at the same time.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's that game of, again, it's that game of taking away as versus adding on to. And
as Matt Pratt will tell you.
Oh, God.
yes. And the thing is, like, there is, if you want to connect materials together, you have to understand both the meta outside framework and the internal framework. I want to talk about, like, for instance, Star Wars and some of the plot contradictions that it has,
Yeah.
has Leia remembering her mother Padme despite Padme dying at birth. You definitely did not remember your mother in the way that you said in, the earlier created movies. But we know that George Lucas intended a full storyline all within the same story. And even when Disney swept in and created their new sequel trilogy, they're still trying to stay all within the same storyline, no matter how much it ends up contradicting with itself.
Like, this is actually kind of something that, we're talking about creators' intention and stuff, and then fans didn't like The Last Jedi, so they tried to go back to contradict it in Rise of Skywalker, and from what I understood, none of the sides were entirely happy with either. So
basically, all you have to do is, like, you have to understand that from the actual logical meta standpoint, a contradiction happened. It's that but you can do an in-universe explanation if you want to try to get around it and be like, well, Leia has these, special memory, whatnot, because of the Force. Like, you can create that all you want to make it internally consistent for yourself, regardless of whether or not the creators intended it. But you have to acknowledge the difference between the creators actually just being like, whoops, and how you're trying to cement it together.
So, one more example I have on this, and this is going to be interesting because I have with me someone who hasn't seen the show and one person who did. So, let me take you back to the 2012 version of the Ninja Turtles.
Oh, boy.
Wolf, I assume you remember what I told you about the intended series finale.
Vaguely, somewhat, yeah. I think I do.
But
It's coming back slowly.
So to
I'm
catch
old.
Haddock up and the viewers who might not know, the series had intended to end on a kind of melancholy note because, for one, the finale kind of parodies Mad Max, and it kind of shows you like a post-apocalyptic future where a lot of the characters established in the series basically are just dead now. Like, it's basically just the turtles who survived and are trying to survive in this apocalyptic future. And say what you want about the episodes themselves, there was actually a thing where Nickelodeon said, just aired that finale in the middle of the season and said, this is an alternate future, this is not canon. But at the same time, Sierra Nieli, the showrunner, said, this is what I intended to be the finale. So now comes the part of, okay, you have two meta sources, from the people behind the show. Which one do you believe?
So this actually reminds me, going back to Rescue Riders, is when Rescue Riders first came out and people started getting their tongues wagging is Dean Deblois said, well, this isn't canon to the How to Train Your Dragon universe. But I'm sure that the Rescue writers themselves would be like, oh, this is part of How to Train Your Dragon. And I think, again, it goes back to that sense of, I think canon needs to be considered from, like, when we're talking about the continuity aspect of it, as concentric circles. So there is an official alternate universe possible ending, or an official ending that might have gone differently. You can understand that there's a difference between this, even when the sources finagle about the details, and what a fan comes up with.
Mm-hmm.
So, there can be, quote unquote, canonical alternate universes, right?
Yeah, but it's interesting that you mention it, because the 2012 Ninja Turtles had a way to handle alternate universes with an alternate universe is the 1987 cartoon version of the Turtles, like other versions of that same franchise. So now you kind of need to ask yourself, what is even an alternate reality in this universe? Is it just another version of the characters entirely, or can a reality actually split at some point? And that just became a whole lot more complicated than I intended.
I do like that idea of concentric circles, though, where you have that main center circle and everything kind of just ripples out from that. And it, sure, they can all affect one another, but you still have that main center circle that started it all, where everything kind of either connects back to, or is outright connected, vaguely connects back to, or is outright connected to it, right? I really enjoy that. That's actually a really good way of looking at that, the concentric circles.
I really like to think about it in terms of comic books, which HC has brought up several times with the Spider-Man universes and so forth. There are so many iterations, storylines, retellings, and completely contradictory things about what happened. That still doesn't mean it wasn't published by Marvel and doesn't have official authority. You can treat it like Greek myths or Norse myths. The myths will contradict, but that there's still stories that are officially the part of the story. Yeah.
I just want to say that DC officially published a story where Superman is a turtle named Super Turtle. Your argument is not valid, people who say this doesn't exist.
This is the best thing that has happened since Frog Thor.
Oh, no. You did. We need to do an entire podcast about Super Turtle. Trust me, it's amazing. You know what? Remind me, once we're done recording, I'll tell you all about it. Just wait. Anyway, so now that we discussed all of this, so do you think we may have mentioned this in passing, but do you think people in fandoms are just rushing to throw the phrase non-canon around?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, especially in a very much a denominator of quality, right? Like, I'm gonna go to my best favorite thing, other than the other thing HC mentioned, other than Rescue Riders, Ruby. Ruby has, because they're owned by Warner Media, is now doing a crossover with DC Comics. Because why not? DC's in every universe. Why not be in the Ruby universe too? And
well, the crossover with the Looney Tunes after this, something's possible.
I did not know that, but fair.
There's a comic where Elmer Fudd hunts Batman. I'm not joking. Google it.
Did not know that, but okay, I'm interested now. But yeah, like, again, like, because owned by Warner, Warner's like, why not? It's popular. Cross it over with DC. Do Batman in the Ruby universe now? It's neat, but people's immediate reaction was, well, not canon, not very good, and that's it. That's their response now. It's kind of disappointing because, yeah, sure, it doesn't line up with Ruby's main story, but at the same time, it's unique. It's interesting. It's it's taking these characters and putting them in the situations that doesn't quite line up, but it potentially can add to their characters and potentially add to the world of Remnant that's in Ruby, right?
And it's something to be enjoyed. It is a story to be enjoyed.
Yeah.
And that's a big thing, right? Like, again, Me as a young wee lad would absolutely agree with these people. If not canon, don't care. Me as I've gotten older is like, you know what? I'm kind of interested in this. I kind of want to see this. It might be great. It might be terrible. It might not be all that good, but I still want to experience it because again, like I said, I don't want to have that narrower focus anymore. I want to broaden that and just see all of these different things. Again, sometimes I get stuff that's really not that great. Sometimes I get stuff that's actually really interesting and really neat because I bothered to say, I want to see this. Whether canon, again, because I put the idea of canon either to the side or just completely ignored it entirely, or I decided to twist the idea of canon and say, I can work with that, or I want to work with that.
I really like that.
Yeah. So I will just agree and say yes. And I think the reason people are kind of just trying to throw that out there is because, and we'll get to this, is because I guess people just don't like the idea of something they don't like connecting to something they do like. Like,
Which I get.
and it kind
Mhm.
of goes against the kind of a mentality nowadays that you can't criticize a thing you like, which is not true. You can be critical of things you like, and like I like a lot of things, and but I obviously criticize some of those things in the podcast. You have recorded evidence that I did. So, but just because I don't necessarily like something that's a part of something big that I do enjoy, it doesn't mean I'll just throw it under the rug and say, nah, it doesn't count, ignore it. No,
That, yeah.
if you, if I get something from it, then you know what, and again, the creators say, sorry, that this is a part of the big thing. This is a part that I not necessarily need to know, but it's something that connects to everything. I can deny that. I can probably say afterwards in my mind, nah, I can ignore it. There's nothing in it that's worthwhile. But other than that,
Yeah, the way I think about it is there are things that I might not emotionally like about the universe and which I personally will not deal with in my own life. But I'm not going to tell other people's that's not canonical, you know. They can accept that as part of their dealings with the universe. And we do not have the right to judge that the official creators were wrong. Like, we can be like, you were stupid, this was a terrible story, but it's still real. And it
Namora,
will
I'm
always be
sorry.
real. And you can't be, non-canonical, it's not real. No, it's real, and you have to accept it, whether or not you like it.
Kingdom Hearts 3 is not real. And it wasn't for a good few years, but yeah, it's real now. But, okay, about that joke. Anyway, um, but speaking of which, are there any examples of movies, games, books, whatever? Is there something that you ever said to yourself, I don't consider this canon?
No. Even with Rescue Riders, I'll be like, I do not accept the premise of talking dragons, but it exists. Cool. It has a right to exist. That's basically as far as I get.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'm
we'll
kind
come back to it.
again, like, going back. When I was younger, yes, I probably would. I definitely did. But again, now that I'm older, not wiser. That's not the idea of this statement at all. I'm very much not wiser. But yeah, but again, as I've changed my definition and my viewpoint and my ideas surrounding canon, right? Not really anymore. Like, there's not much there's not really anything that I would look at and say, yeah, no, that's not canon. I don't agree with that. I don't care about that or anything like that, right? It's canon. It exists.
Well, I'll probably surprise
The
you. I have one.
Okay, let's hear it.
Okay, so in case you don't know, hi, I'm HC. I'm a Sonic the Hedgehog fan. Let's talk
Oh, of
about
course.
that.
Oh, I think I know where this is going.
Okay, you know what? It might not go in the way you think. So, to those of you who are unaware, in 2008, a little indie company called BioWare have made a Sonic RPG called Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood.
That was made by BioWare?
Yep.
That was
that.
the first thing that popped into my head. I was like, oh crap, that was BioWare.
That was made by BioWare's B team, I should stress, the B team. And the thing about that game is that it pretty much sets itself as the furthest thing that's happening in the Sonic timeline. Like, this is the again, there's not much of a plot connection between the games. Like, you can play one without playing the other, but they said this is the last thing that happens chronologically, because the first thing that happens in this game is that they basically defeat Eggman for good. And then Sonic runs away for 2 years. No joke, this is the plot. Like, what the fuck thought about that? And then after all the things happen in that game, the game ends on a cliffhanger. And so, for one, the reason I don't want to consider this canon is because obviously they didn't resolve the plot. So I just, in my own personal bubble, I suppose, I don't want to have a story that's not finished be a part of a mythology that doesn't really care about this kind of stuff. So at the end of the day, it's not necessarily not canon. Just I don't care about it. But then again, Sega themselves kind of said, we are cutting ties with everything that's related to this game. We don't want to acknowledge anything that's happening in it. True, they are doing this for legal reasons, and we are not opening that closet, trust me. But at the same time, again, kind of comes down to the entire, if the corporation behind the franchise says we are not going to touch upon this anymore, we are not going to explore it for whatever reasons, I don't have any reason to do so myself.
I guess, right, it does, beg the question of, where do you as an individual go when you enjoy and like something, but the creator of the thing says that this side material that you enjoy and like, it's not canon. Where do you go at that point? I suppose, do you just continue to accept it as your own personal canon, or do you say, okay, no, they're fair, it's not canon anymore?
So the way I want to say this is, I think that the reason that creators are starting to say, oh, this is canon or this isn't canon, is because it's a reaction to the fandom and the fandom's obsession with congruity.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reason why somebody like Dean Deblaw mentioned Rescue Riders. And it's the reason why Disney was like, oh, now we have Star Wars Legends, this whole other separate timeline, and we're creating our new canon. But the way they phrased it was basically dump everything out. And I had to point out to my friends, I'm like, no, this still exists. This entire timeline still exists. It's not gone.
Yeah.
And I think that's the way that you have to treat it, is like Star Wars Legends. It still exists. It's still real. It's still its own universe. It doesn't go away, whether or not the creators are still building upon it. It was still at some point in time created by creators who intended it to be part of the story. Concentric circles again.
That's completely fair, yeah.
Yeah, agreed. But going from keeping with the non-canon thing, what do you think about the idea that people just use non-canon as a description of criticism or quality? Like when they say, we don't like this, so it's not canon. Jumping the gun because I'm still talking kinda. I don't agree with this at all. Like, this is not a thing. This is
they're wrong.
No way.
Yeah, they're just they're freaking wrong. Yeah. Something can be lesser quality and still canon. You can separate these two. And if you call it non-canonical just because you don't like it, you're rejecting the authority of the people who make the material. And whether or not you like them being an authority, they are the people who made the material. You have to accept the difference between official and unofficial materials.
Yes. Example I have for this is actually The Last of Us Part Two. I have a friend who we both loved the first The Last of Us game, and we were really looking forward to the second one, and we were both disappointed by it for different reasons, but still we both felt it wasn't as good as the first one by a long shot. And the first thing, his one sentence review of it was, "It's not canon." And it's like, no, I don't like the game, and I have some beef with what the game director said about the game, but at the same time, it's not that I'm just gonna treat it as non-canon anymore. Like if they make a Last of Us Part Three and they can somehow make all of this woke, so I don't want them to just ignore it. It exists. I am holding my copy right now of it. It's not.
Exactly
I can,
because it exists, you should criticize it.
but like criticize it. I don't care. Like I trust me. I've spoken plenty of criticism about that game, but at the same time, I can't just say, "Oh, it doesn't matter anymore," just because I don't like it.
I think right, canon, canon versus non-canon as a critique, it is too personal, right? Because canon is this thing that exists quite honestly very differently depending on who you talk to, and sometimes depending on what day and what time you talk to those same people as well, right? That it's difficult to use canon versus non-canon as a critique per se. That's not to say, critique should be unbiased and not personal, because that's what critique is. It's a very personal thing. But I think we should focus on, instead of the sometimes nebulous idea that canon and non-canon is, focus on, if you're going to critique something, focus on the things that you can more quote unquote factually critique, right? Things that actually matter. Is it a good story? Are these characters done well? Is the world designed in an interesting and unique way? Things of that nature, right? Talk about those things and your opinion on those things and where they land for you personally, either good or bad, preferably both.
Yeah. The way I see it is that at this point in time, I know as a linguist that the meaning of words is determined by how people use them, and how people are using canon is expanding to things like this. But this is one of the things that I'm actually frustrated about, because I feel like the way people are using the word canon turns conversation into conflations and equivocations. People are debating past each other because the word canon has gotten so muddled. We're not talking on the same thing at all. And so my drive is we should use the word canon as an official term to designate something objective. That way we aren't talking past each other. And so when people try to use something as "it's not canon" as a descriptor of quality, that's the exact antithesis of what I think would be good for fandom, and which would end all the fandom wars where people are like, "That's canon, that's not canon." Make it objective.
That's really interesting. And that's kind of a problem I have too, where, again, like, I kind of mentioned earlier, where I think canon is too all-encompassing of a word. And I think the English language, especially when you take into account the internet and discussion on the internet, right? Some words tend to become too all-encompassing of a word, and we need to narrow their focus, or to split them into other things and other categories, because and that, to be fair, that does come with its own problems, and that you would need to solve as well, potentially, right? But again, I think, right, more specific, or more like, I'm trying to think of the right word here and I cannot. Again, like, splitting it up and being either more specific, or just denoting exactly what you're talking about more, than using something that is either too all-encompassing or too nebulous, can be more helpful in discussion. I think.
Yeah. So again, I think the basic thing we can say about this is that a piece, whether you like it or not, it exists. You can't deny its existence, even if you try. So using the term it doesn't exist as to tell people of its quality, it's just wrong.
I
Like really, we say this as a joke, but honestly, that's really the best way to describe it. It's just not really true. You can just wish something to go away.
there is there is a counter argument to this that we should probably bring up and at least go over a bit, right? In terms of thoughts, and it's the idea that you can't say something doesn't exist, and people, and I know for a fact there's at least going to be a few that'll say, but what about Avatar, the last Airbender movie?
There's jokes, and
Mm,
then there's actually denying something completely to the point that you pretend
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't have any, no, that you determine it has no authority because you don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Also, you say this, but again, Avatar: The Last Airbender movie, as awful as it is, and as much as you want to make fun of it, yeah, it's not canonical to the show technically. It's a retelling. It's
Fair.
not something that it doesn't try to give you something to tell you something new about the world or tell you something else with these characters. It's retelling the first season. So when people say that doesn't exist, it's not necessarily a thing of quality. It's just that it doesn't really have any reason to exist because you have the first season of the show, which is always available for you to watch.
Yeah, I always just hear people saying it doesn't exist as a joke.
Yeah, this
So,
is fair too. I
Yeah.
do
yeah,
as well.
Yeah, it is a
yeah.
joke because
I say
there
it
is
too.
that line in the show that there's no movie in Bossing Say, so people just kind of took it to an extreme.
Yeah.
On that note, expect to hear all about it when the live action series of Avatar: The Last Airbender hits sometime because
Oh
people
gosh.
That's gonna be fun. I can't wait.
Oh gosh, this is gonna be. We're gonna be watching things from the fandom. Oh my goodness.
uh, Actually, you know something? Fun fact. Um, The Legend of Korra actually had a video game at some point. Bet you didn't see this one coming. And there wasn't a war necessarily about it, but there was actually a debate if the game is canon or not, because it does have a plot that doesn't adapt any of the seasons, but at the same time, it's also kind of like a nothing plot. Like even if it's canon, it doesn't really mean anything. And again, the main argument people used in favor of it is the creators of the show wrote the game, so you can't really argue with that, even if you don't like the game.
So, one thing that I want to, this actually sort of goes back to some of our previous conversation about people throwing the phrase not canon versus canon around prematurely. I think that people too often jump to, this is another instance of people using canon in place of the word continuity and people using the word canon in place of creators. And I think that both of these are problematic. I think we've covered why canon for continuity doesn't work. I mean, even a single well-written story is going to have plot errors between it, and there's no arbitrary point at which suddenly it becomes so inconsistent with itself it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And then you can't use canon for creator because the more you think about it, the more it falls away. If you actually held that line of argument, you would always be inconsistent with yourself. Like the Wheel of Time series, it was finished by Brandon Sanderson instead of Robert Jordan. Creator switch, it's still canonical. We can talk about the comic book series in which there's 3,000 different writers, sometimes on the same storyline, sometimes in, one shots, whatever. Still comes out of Marvel. And taking the hypothetical situation, How to Train Your Dragon movies, of course, they're not written by the author of the books. We're not going to call the basis of the DreamWorks franchise non-canonical because it wasn't written by Cressida Cowell. And in the theoretical aspect that, let's say that they had gotten someone completely new to write How to Train Your Dragon 3, and it was neither Chris Sanders nor Dean DeBlois, we'd still call this canon. It's part of the trilogy. You wouldn't drop it suddenly because you had a creator switch. And so while I think that talking about like creators is a way to help solidify the official status of it, because we're understanding the creator's mind, as we were talking about near the beginning, it's a way to help affirm, oh yeah, these are all connected together. You can't use creator just as a synonym for canon.
Hear that, psychopaths in time haters? Boom! In your faces! I actually saw a video. YouTube recommended me a video about two people saying why that game is not canon to its predecessors, and I was like, oh my god, these people are morons. So yeah, thank you for that.
I have strong feelings about this.
That's fair.
Okay, just to kind of move on for that. So we talked about this, but do you think there's a better system than canon or not canon to describe such works? Like Haddock would probably say continuity. Like, is it in continuity with the previous stuff?
Yeah, technically, I've completely dropped the word canon from my vocabulary online because I got so sick of saying the same things over and over and over. I use the word official materials, and nobody debates with me when I use the word official materials because everyone understands what I mean. So I think that a better system is official versus unofficial materials. Primary, main sources versus minor sources, and then use words like continuity, consistency, and congruency more. And that would be a much more comprehensible system of discussion, and we would all be on the same page and not arguing past each other.
Yeah. So, kind of an improv question, since I brought up Sly Cooper, that suddenly sprung to me. So, bonus question, ding ding. What do you think about fan works that try to be canon?
They're cool and they're fun, but they're still made by fans. No matter how popular they get, they can be very popular. They're still their own separate thing. They're still fandom.
Yeah, I again, right? Like, I've wrote fan fiction, I suppose, and when I write, I try to write in a way that makes it feel like, if you saw this within the show or whatever I'm writing for, right, that you wouldn't bat an eye about it, right? Like, I try to write with that in mind. I try to keep things as consistent as I possibly can to make it feel like it would fit, like it would work. But it's still, it's my take, right? It's never going to be 100% the creator's take because I'm not a creator. I have no connection to them. So it's still my take. It's still my thing, right? So it's still not canon. If you read my stuff and want to view my stuff as canon, I'm not going to complain. But, I will take that honor, and I will absolutely wear it as a badge of honor. But yeah, it's still like my work isn't canon. My work isn't, my work, it's not canon. Like, I think absolutely fan works can, be on the same pedestal as, the original works. Like, they can be of the same kind of quality. They can even be potentially better in quality. But that doesn't mean they are the same thing.
Yeah, if I hopped onto it, I'd be saying basically the exact same things as you. When I write fan fiction, which admittedly is not too often, but when I do, I'm trying to synthesize everything I know from the official sources to build something that feels as close to the official sources as you can. But it's still my take.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm asking this because, again, I've seen there's this guy that's trying to kind of make his own Sly Fall. They're actually trying to make a game, and they made a bunch of YouTube videos about what their plot for it would be, which I'll be honest with you, I actually do kind of like more in concept over the actual game we got, but all I see in those comments sometimes is people telling them, "You'll never be canon. You'll never be canon. You'll never be canon." It's like,
Who cares?
yeah, it's like that's not the point. That's not the point. The point is that there's a group of fans who are really passionate about a franchise that's been sadly dead for a long time, and good on them for actually trying getting a vision out there, and to such extreme. They could have just written it as a fan fiction, posted it somewhere, and maybe someone would read it. But no, they're actually trying to make a game. That's impressive. So canon or not
There
canon, I don't care. Bring me more content.
This reminds me of Star Trek fan movies where they actually got the original actors, like people like Walter Koenig, to come in and act as part of their actual shows.
Oh
And
man.
it's wonderful to see them in these, whether or not the plots of the stories themselves are good. Well, that's a separate discussion. But, but they did that. This is a highly centralized, well-coordinated fandom movement, but it's still fandom. It's just more well-known to more people than, if I had written a Star Trek story and 3 people saw it on fanfiction.net, right? So,
Mhm.
and I think that's why the word fanon exists, is because we understand that sometimes a huge chunk of the fandom has accepted a common idea, even though we understand it's not technically canon.
Yes.
That's why fanon exists. Undertale fandom pops to mind, where the Undertale fandom has entire universes that the entire fandom understands, even though Toby Fox never conceived them.
Yep.
Uh,
Well,
well,
Wolf, you want to say something?
yeah. One last question. We kind of skipped over it, but since we are in the idea of
Yeah.
canon
I was
and
about to bring it up, but
oh,
sure,
well,
ask it.
you go ahead then.
So, talking about headcanons and fan fictions and stuff, have you ever came across a headcanon or a fan fiction, whatever, that you would say is better than than the official stuff?
I can't say that it's better. The things that I like the best are where you take different parts of the franchise and you synthesize them together in a way that feels really plausible and smoothly connected, regardless of whether or not the creators intended that way. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. I like that. I like that interpretation. But I'm always going to consider it an interpretation and not the same thing. So I just conceive of headcanon and canon so differently that there's no point at which my mind can supersede the headcanon over the canon. So
Wolf?
yeah, I can just never treat it as the same status. So even if I'm like, oh, that's cool, I've never been able to be like, oh, that's better than canon, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Wolf, what do you say?
For my part, it's not been super often, but I think it for me it's happened most with Ruby. Because Ruby it sits in an extremely strange spot where it feels super fleshed out, but then there are times when it's, I guess, not super fleshed out. Like it feels like a world that it's strange, right? Because Ruby is an amazing, fairly well developed world, but then at the same time, it feels like it's so easy to add into and add onto, and anything that you add into and onto feels like this fits, it works. And there is stuff that, looking at a particular character, Raven Branwyn, right? Uh,
Mhm.
there's stuff that's been added to her by fans, myself included, that because the character's not had a lot of screen time and was kind of there for a small amount of time, there's not a lot for her in canon. And for me, I have to be extremely careful when I'm talking about the character because I have to always keep in mind this is what I had canon for the character. This is what fanon thinks for the character. This isn't what the actual canon character is. and I have to be extremely careful because the canon character isn't the greatest of people, but the fanon character is a very different type of person, right? And it's interesting because I do kind of enjoy the fanon side more, but at the same time, it's not canon. It is its own separate entity and thing now. And again, as I'm someone who is still kind of figuring out to some degree how I, explicitly want to view fanon material compared to canon material in a lot of ways, it is hard, I suppose to say, to work that out.
That makes
that
sense.
makes
This
sense.
room. If HC has something to say, go for it first, because I want to expand upon what Wolf said to a
No
pretty
problem.
large degree.
I'll just sum up by saying that a lot of that some of the things I usually see especially when people say that something is not canon or like fan fiction, yada yada yada, is that whenever ships are thrown into the mix,
Oh.
and the thing is that whether you like it or not, like sometimes a lot of the fan stuff in fan fiction that you see is ships, be it official ones or not. And don't get me wrong, people who ship some stuff, that's perfectly fine. And I have my own weird ships. I'm not trying to discredit anyone, but at the same time, when all you see is ships and not necessarily something else that can develop the world in another way, then I end up not really caring what you throw at me, because there are several ways you can approach a romance story, and a lot of them are just stuff that you end up seeing in other movies anyway. You just change the characters. So me being me, a lot of the franchises I like have romance in them, but it's not the main focus. Like whenever let's say I'm looking for a good Sonic fan fiction, I'll find like a bunch of shipping ones which I don't care about because Sonic is never about that. So these kind of things don't really give me anything. And then let's say an official piece tries to do something with it, uh, then everyone will just say, "Oh, it's not as good as that guy did it because that's what they grew up on and stuff." And it's like, so when most of the fan stuff I see is ships, and there are so many ways you can approach writing this stuff that some people will like, some people will don't. It's just, what is the point I was trying to get at? I had a point.
Honestly, the entire topic of ships and how people treat them canonically prematurely could be its own podcast.
Yeah, probably.
There's so much to talk about. Like, if you went into that, I would be talking about the Voltron fandom for a very long time and how people misinterpreted certainly non-romantic things as clearly intending to be endgame romance and all of that.
The Ruby Phantom says
I
hi
think-
too.
Oh boy. I think most fandom can say hi to some degree on this.
Yeah, this is fair.
I am sure some people are already waiting outside of my house with a baseball bat ready to hit me. But the fact of the matter is, I think essentially what this leads up to is that a lot of fans, if they just are exposed to something for the first time through a fan fiction or something, when the official piece starts doing it, they are going to have that in mind and they are going to compare it. But at the same time, I just don't think it's the right thing to do, because just like the fan fiction is another take on the official source material, the official source material could be another take on what you see in a fan fiction. It doesn't have to play out the same way. And I think people miss that.
Yeah, I think the main problem people have, especially with ships because they're so emotionally attached to them, but it can happen anywhere in plot, is people come in with preconceived notions of what they have headcanoned and what they believe will happen, that when subsequent seasons of a show don't follow their preconceived notions, they get angry because they're like, you guys wrote this wrong. You guys didn't, stick to continuity or stick to how you were characterizing things. despite the fact that this was all actually their own personal interpretation and not actually part of the material.
Yes.
This a lot because, again, like going back to, I talked about the character Raven earlier, right? This is something, there's a potential possibility for this character to come back into the show at this point, and they could potentially do her exactly as I have her imagined in my head, or it could be vastly different. Either way, I as a person, right, have to be respectful of that, right? I need to be, and remember that, if it is different, that's okay. That's actually, and I do try and come at it with the approach of, I hope it is different. I want to see. I don't want to see them do. I don't want to see the writers behind any given show do what this person did, but better. I want to see their take, right? I want to see the creators' take on this thing. I have this person's take. I enjoy this person's take, or I have my take. I enjoy my take, but I'm not here to see you do what I already know and what I've already experienced. I want to see something new, or potentially new, at least, anyways. And if you do give me something new, great. If you give me something similar, that's fine. I still am here for your take on this.
That's really cool, and I like you saying that. The desire to want something new instead of the desire to match what you've already come up with. This reminds me of Undertale. I don't know how familiar you guys are with like Undertale and Gaster discussions.
I have it installed on my PS4. I need to play it.
All right. Well, are you fine with me talking about very obscure things that you are probably not going to see unless you play 200 hours of the game?
There's a good chance I might forget as well, so shoot.
Okay, because literally this stuff is so obscure that even with my 200 some hours of gameplay, I've only seen a fraction of it out besides, except for, seeing YouTube videos of people who've actually, pulled this out. So what happens with Undertale is there's this mystery character that's very subtly inserted and will sometimes randomly appear on rare occasions, or we think he appears. He's very subtly suggested, and this is W.D. Gaster. And some of this stuff you can only get if you hack into the game and go to unfinished scenes. Other times you go into a game and the game will randomize a number between 1 to 100 just behind the scenes. And if the game randomizes the exact right number, you'll run into like these ghost people who talk about how Gaster fell into his own creation and died, or other really mysterious things like this. So there's all these little hints peppered throughout Undertale that you can sort of start to piece and knit them together. And of course, since they're so vague, there's lots of very beautiful ways that fans have knit them together. And so the fandom has come to this basic idea of who we believe Gaster is, and lots of people come up with a very similar story of who Gaster is. I have my own Gaster take. I've written a story with Gaster. Didn't finish, but I did. And that's the thing, is Gaster is 90% fandom at this point, and barely is just based on the fringes of little cool, creepy hints. But at this point, if Toby Fox added more to Gaster in his new game, Deltarune, which is connected to Undertale in some capacity, then it would go against what fans have headcanoned. And there's a part of me that because the Gaster stuff has been so fun because it's so vague, I almost don't want Toby to ever give us a concrete answer. I'd be fine with him peppering in more hints, but I almost don't want him to give an answer because the legend of Gaster is so fun without an answer.
Yeah. Actually, now that you said it, kind of reminds me of the Ratman from Portal. Mm-hmm. That it's like an unseen character, but there are hints about who he is, and people just took it and flew in all different directions with it. So
yes.
That's cool.
Yeah. So that's sort of what it's like. So it's really cool, but again, it's all fandom conjecture.
Mm-hmm. So, I think that's it.
Yeah, it seems so. Unless, Haddock, do you have anything else you'd like to talk about or add?
I think that we've covered a really good chunk of things, and if anybody wants to see me ranting more, they can just go to my Tumblr or whatever. So this has been a great discussion.
Okay, So you already said how people can find you online.
It will be linked in
I
the
am-
description for folks, but
Yeah,
go ahead
I
and
am
list, say it
King
again.
of the Wilderwest. I'm king of the Wilderwest.tumblr.com, all one word. Yeah.
Okay, so that's been all for this episode of the Outcast. We hope you enjoyed. What are your thoughts about the canon discussion? You can tell us all about this in the comment section below, on our Twitter, which is Berkcast with a capital B, capital C, and on our Tumblr, which is Berkcast Team. So until next time, I was HC.
I was Wolf.
And I am Haddock.
And we will see you all next time. Take care.
Bye-bye.